The bloody shoe hit the glass door just before sunrise. At first, no one inside the fire station moved. The wind had been howling since 3 a.m., and it wasn't unusual for trash or tree limbs to get tossed into the lot during a storm. But when the rookie went to check and didn't come back right away, Captain Reyes stood up. "Everything good out there?" he called out from the back. The silence that followed wasn't natural. Not for this place. Not for a crew trained to act fast. Reyes walked toward the bay doors, expecting to see maybe a broken sign, maybe even a raccoon. What he wasn't expecting was the young firefighter frozen in place, hand halfway to his radio, staring at a wild bobcat standing still as a statue, just inches from the front steps. It wasn't the bobcat that stopped him cold. It was what was hanging from its mouth, a child's sneaker, torn, small, and soaked in blood. The bobcat didn't growl. It didn't flinch. It just stood there in the fog, eyes locked on the door, waiting for something no one understood. The rookie whispered without turning, "Cap, what do we do?" Reyes didn't answer. He stepped forward, slowly, calmly, but his heartbeat was pounding. The bobcat took one step closer and laid the shoe on the ground. Then it backed away, limping, and stared. There was something in its eyes, panic maybe, or urgency. Reyes had seen it before, in people, in parents, in survivors, not in animals. He crouched to examine the shoe, fresh blood. The laces were half burned, frayed at the ends. This wasn't old. This wasn't a dropped toy or roadkill. Something, or someone, was out there. Reyes looked up again, but the bobcat had already turned and started walking toward the woods, not running, just leading. The captain radioed dispatch with a short message. "Possible trauma victim. Child, unknown location. Wild animal delivered evidence to station." The voice on the other end paused before responding. "Can you repeat that?" But Reyes had already waved his team to gear up. He didn't care. How crazy it sounded. A bobcat just brought them a message, and he wasn't going to ignore it. Boots hit mud within 2 minutes. 3 firefighters followed the trail, flashlights slicing through early dawn mist. The bobcat wasn't fast. It'd stop every few yards, look back, make sure they were still following. Something about that behavior unsettled everyone. Wild animals don't act like this, not unless they've been trained, not unless they've seen something no human has. Then came the smell. It hit them just beyond the tree line, metallic, smoky, a mix of ash and something worse. Reyes raised a hand to stop the group. That's when they saw the clearing. Blackened earth, burned tree bark, and something lying in the middle of it all. The bobcat paced near the edge of the scene, not daring to get closer now. Reyes approached first, flashlight trembling ever so slightly, in his grip, and there it was, a backpack, tiny, purple, melted zipper, and beside it a trail of blood dragging through the dirt. The same size shoe as before, still attached to a small, lifeless foot, but the body wasn't there, just the foot. Just a trail, and the bobcat, now whimpering softly, turned and started walking again. Reyes didn't hesitate. They were no longer following a wild animal. They were following the only witness, and someone, somewhere, was still alive. The trail of blood curved into the trees like a lifeline unraveling in silence. Reyes moved ahead without looking back, boots slipping slightly in the damp undergrowth. The others followed close behind, but no one said a word. They didn't need to. Every man on that team had seen trauma, fires, car wrecks, scenes where you don't look too long, or it stays with you forever. But none of them had ever followed a wild bobcat into the woods because of a child's bloody shoe. And yet, here they were, moving faster now because something deep inside told them time was running out. The bobcat's limp was more pronounced. It staggered with each step, but refused to stop. Its coat was caked in ash and sap, one ear notched, ribs showing through patches of fur. Whatever had happened back there, this animal had survived it. And it hadn't just run for safety, it had run for help. No one could say that out loud yet, but they all knew it. Reyes tightened his grip on the flashlight, eyes scanning the trail for more signs, fabric, prints, anything to give him hope that the child was still breathing. Then they saw it. A crumpled red jacket half buried under wet leaves, the kind with reflective tape on the sleeves. Reyes dropped to his knees and pulled it free. Inside the pocket, he found a pacifier, clean and unused, and a small plastic charm shaped like a bear. The kind you clip onto a diaper bag, the kind a toddler doesn't let go of. He swallowed hard and looked up. The Bobcat had stopped again. It was panting now, body shaking from exhaustion, but its eyes were still locked ahead. Just beyond the next bend, the trees broke open to a clearing scarred by fire. The ground was black and smoking, a crooked tree still smouldering at its base. And there, just beyond the edge of the burned soil, was a form, small, still, too still. Reyes rushed forward, heart slamming into his ribs, but the moment he dropped, beside the child, everything else faded. She was no more than 3 years old, curled on her side, face streaked with soot and blood, hair matted against her cheek, one shoe missing, skin cold. Her tiny hands were clenched into fists like she had been trying to hold on. His voice cracked as he shouted for the medbag. The others dropped beside him, unrolling blankets, checking vitals, snapping open the oxygen mask. She had a pulse, but it was weak, thready. A whisper of life holding on by inches. Reyes wrapped her in his arms, lifting her from the dirt as gently as he could. The moment he stood up, the Bobcat let out a low, broken sound. Not a growl, not a cry, just something in between, a sound soaked in relief. Then it collapsed onto its side, chest rising and falling rapidly. It had made it. It had led them here. And now it had nothing left to give. Reyes turned to the others. "Get the stretcher, now!" Back at the fire station, EMTs were already waiting, called the moment the shoe was found. The radio had been buzzing with updates, but no one could have prepared them for the sight of Reyes stepping out of the woods, clothes covered in ash, cradling a child in his arms with a wild bobcat dragging itself behind him. The team cleared. A path straight into the ambulance. The little girl's vitals were fading fast, but the paramedics worked quickly, slipping in an IV, fitting the oxygen, doing everything they could to keep her heart beating. Reyes didn't leave her side until the doors closed. The Bobcat, too weak to stand, was lifted gently onto a tarp by animal control. But even then, it didn't resist. It just lay there, eyes half closed, as if it knew it had done what it was meant to do. No one dared call it a pet. No one dared say it was just an animal, because something about the way it had looked back, the way it had waited, that wasn't instinct, that was loyalty, that was love, and no one could explain it. At the hospital, the girl was stabilized. Her name was Lily, 3 years old, reported missing 12 hours earlier after a fire had swept through a cabin up in the hills. Her parents had gone for help but never returned. Rangers later found their bodies a few miles away, burned, collapsed from smoke. But Lily had survived, barely, and according to the burns on her hands and knees, she'd crawled a long way through the wreckage before collapsing. The doctor said she had maybe another hour left in her if she hadn't been found. But she was. Because something wild had refused to give up on her. The hospital room was dimly lit, with only the quiet hum of machines filling the space. Tubes ran across Lily's arms. Monitors blinked in rhythm with her shallow breaths, and the oxygen mask fogged slightly with each exhale. Reyes stood outside the glass window, arms folded tightly across his chest, watching every tiny movement as if his eyes alone could will her to keep fighting. He hadn't spoken much since they arrived, just gave the doctors every detail they needed, then went silent again. Not because he was lost for words, but because something inside him couldn't shake the weight of what he'd seen. A child, that close to death. A wild animal that had refused to let her die. Down the hall, reporters had already begun to gather. News had traveled faster than anyone could have expected. "Bobcat saves toddler from fire," one headline read. "Wildlife. Hero or miracle," said another. By morning, the story was everywhere. TV crews parked outside the fire station. Wildlife officials scrambled to explain the animal's behavior. And in every interview, the question circled back the same way. How could a bobcat do that? No one had an answer. Not even Reyes. What he did know, though, was that the animal hadn't just stumbled upon the girl. It hadn't fled the fire. It had gone to the station on purpose. It had waited, brought them evidence, led them step by step, and that wasn't coincidence. Later that evening, Reyes received a call from the vet who had taken the bobcat in. Her voice was shaky. "You need to come see this for yourself." The clinic was quiet when he arrived. No news crews, no noise, just the low buzz of overhead lights and the scent of antiseptic. In a large enclosure near the back, the bobcat lay curled on a blanket, breathing slow but steady, a deep wound. Along its flank had been cleaned and stitched. One leg was bandaged. "But it was alive. He's not feral," the vet said gently. "I don't think he ever was," Reyes frowned. "You're saying someone raised him?" "I'm saying someone loved him. That's the only way you get an animal like this." She walked him to a table near the office. There, laid out under a soft light, were photographs, half-burned, some barely intact, found near the girl's cabin. One showed a small baby in a diaper laughing beside what looked like a young bobcat, a cub. Another showed a teenage girl bottle-feeding it. In one, there was a handwritten label, "Milo Rescued 2021. Reyes stared at the name. "Milo," the vet nodded. "That's what her mother called him in the vet's files. Looks like they found him injured as a kitten, raised him in secret. Probably bottle-fed, socialized, trained gently. Never reported, of course, because who would believe a family raising a bobcat? And he stayed." The vet's eyes softened. "He stayed because he loved her." Outside, the rain had started again. Reyes leaned against the glass, watching the storm build. But his thoughts were back in the woods, with the sight of that injured animal pacing through fire for a child. Lily had grown up with him, slept next to him, shared snacks with him, learned to walk holding his fur. And when the world turned to smoke and flame, he didn't run. He remembered. Back at the hospital, something changed. Lily opened her eyes. It wasn't dramatic or loud, just a quiet flutter, a small shift in the monitors, and then those wide, confused eyes staring at the ceiling. Her father, who hadn't left her side since she was brought in, let out a sound that cracked through the stillness like thunder. Nurses rushed in, doctors followed, but Lily didn't cry, she didn't panic. Her first word, weak and broken behind the oxygen mask, was barely audible. "Milo?" Reyes got the call 30 minutes later. He didn't go to the station. He didn't brief the team. He went straight to the animal clinic, pulled the vet aside and said, "We're taking him to her." They didn't announce it. No reporters. No noise. Just a soft blanket, a quiet hallway, and the slow push of a wheelchair as Lily was brought into a room near the back of the clinic. When Milo was gently carried into the room, the child's face changed. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with recognition. Her fingers twitched. And when the bobcat lifted his head and let out the softest chuff, the little girl reached out without hesitation. He pressed his nose to her hand, and for the first time since the fire, she smiled. Everyone in that room turned away for a moment. Not because they weren't watching, but because they didn't want their tears to fall too loudly. This wasn't just rescue, this was reunion, and it wasn't over yet. The photo of Lily touching her hand to Milo's fur went viral before anyone at the hospital even realized a picture had been taken. By the time morning rolled in, news vans had lined the street outside the clinic, their satellites aimed at the sky, desperate for a headline that now had the country leaning forward. "Wild Bobcat Rescues Toddler" was printed in bold across every screen. But as the story spread, so did the questions. Some called it a miracle, others called it irresponsible. And somewhere in the noise, the quiet reality of a little girl and her best friend was nearly drowned by the weight of public scrutiny. Officials arrived that afternoon. Not reporters, but men in jackets marked wildlife management and public safety. They walked in with clipboards and neutral expressions, asking questions that felt colder than the rain outside. Who raised the bobcat? Was it registered? Had anyone seen signs of domestication? The vet answered carefully, trying to protect both the animal and the family, but it was clear what was coming. Milo wasn't a dog, and the law didn't care how many lives he had saved. Lily's father stood in the hallway outside the exam room, arms crossed tightly, eyes burning with something too deep to name. He'd already lost his wife, his home, he nearly lost his daughter, and now, after everything, they were trying to take away the one creature who had refused to leave her side. When they asked for access to the bobcat for evaluation and transport, his voice cut through the hallway like a blade. "You'll have to go through me." It was Reyes who stepped in. He asked for 10 minutes. Just 10 minutes to speak with the team. They hesitated. But they gave him 5. He didn't waste them. "We're not dealing with a wild animal," he told them. "We're dealing with loyalty, with memory, with an animal that stayed in a burning forest and walked into a firehouse just to bring us help. What's written in your manuals doesn't explain that. What's in front of you does." They didn't respond. But they didn't act either, at least not yet. Back in the clinic room, Lily sat cross-legged on a blanket beside Milo, now stronger, fed and stitched with care. She didn't talk much, just kept petting his ears gently like she had done since. She was old enough to crawl. Occasionally she'd whisper to him, things only he understood. Her father watched from the doorway, arms trembling at the thought of what might come next. The twist came not from the state, but from the people. Hundreds of letters began arriving at the station. Handwritten notes, postcards, drawings from children. Some came from across the state, others from across the country. One read, "My son cried when he saw the video. He said that Kitty saved her because she's his sister." Another read, "If loyalty like that isn't protected, what is?" A petition launched online. Within 24 hours, it hit 500,000 signatures. People weren't just invested, they were furious at the thought of Milo being seized, relocated, or worse. The firehouse voicemail filled with messages from animal rights advocates, former wildlife officers, and everyday parents who saw something in this story that cut deeper than news ever could. A child had been saved, not by a system or a stranger, but by something primal, something pure. It was Elena, who had worked quietly in the background, who uncovered something critical. While digging through local ordinances and buried documents, she found an old but still valid clause under the state's Emergency Wildlife Rehab Statute. It stated that animals raised under the direct care of a family for rehabilitation, if proven to be essential for the well-being of a minor, could be evaluated for permanent placement under the category of emotional support and companion. It had only ever been used once, over a decade ago, but it was still law. Reyes walked into the hospital with the printed clause in hand. He gave it to Lily's father with a look that said everything he couldn't put into words. They had a chance, but they'd have to fight. The next hearing was set for 3 days later. In the meantime, the clinic became a place of vigil. Strangers left flowers at the windows. Someone built a handmade wooden sign that read, "Thank you, Milo." Firefighters stood post outside the doors, not because they were ordered to, but because none of them were going to let a quiet act of heroism be turned into a crime. Inside, Lily's strength grew. The burns healed slowly, but her spirit burned brighter than ever. Doctors said she was recovering faster than expected. Some even whispered that they had never seen a child fight so hard to live. But anyone who saw her with Milo understood why. Her world hadn't burned down completely, because the one creature who had been there through every moment of her young life was still right beside her, even if the world tried to take him away. The courtroom wasn't built for stories like this. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting sterile light across worn wooden benches and a judge's bench that had seen decades of routine cases, noise complaints, property lines, speeding tickets. But today, every seat was filled. News cameras were banned from entering. but they lined the hallway outside, and the buzz from reporters and spectators gave the air a charged electric weight. This wasn't just a local hearing anymore. It was national. People had taken sides, and most of them weren't quiet about it. Lily sat in the front row beside her father, legs swinging above the floor, holding a stuffed version of Milo that someone had mailed in last week. The real Milo, of course, wasn't there. He was still at the clinic under protective watch, guarded now by 3 firefighters who rotated shifts to ensure no one could remove him without going through them first. The vet had testified via letter, stating clearly that the Bobcat posed no threat, had shown no signs of aggression, and most importantly, would likely never survive in the wild after years of human bonding. But it wasn't the vet's voice. People waited for. It was Lily's. The courtroom hushed when she was called forward. She didn't walk up alone. Her father carried her gently, like she was still made of glass. The judge, an older woman with tired eyes and a reputation for being by the book, allowed it. There was something in the girl's small frame, the way her arms tightened around her father's neck, that softened even the most hardened expressions in the room. She was placed in the witness chair, feet barely brushing the edge. A microphone stood taller than her. When the court clerk leaned in to adjust it, Lily flinched. Her father whispered something in her ear, and she nodded slowly, fingers fidgeting. With the hem of her dress, Lily, the attorney asked gently, "Can you tell us who Milo is?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He's my best friend." "And how long have you known Milo?" "Since I was a baby," she said, then paused, correcting herself. "Since before I could talk." There was a quiet murmur in the courtroom, the kind that rises when people aren't sure whether to smile or cry. The attorney continued carefully. "Do you feel safe when you're with Milo?" "Yes." "Why?" Lily looked up then, eyes clearer than anyone expected. "Because when the fire came and I was really scared. He didn't leave. He stayed. He brought help and he found me again." The attorney stepped back. No more questions. No one dared cross-examine her. When Lily returned to her father's arms, the room remained quiet for a long while. Then came testimony from the fire captain, the rescue team, the vet, and even Elena, who laid out the rare state clause that could allow the Bobcat to remain with the family under monitored guardianship. The arguments were logical, legal, emotional, but nothing landed quite like the child's voice had. Still, the state attorney pressed back. Laws were laws. Wild animals, even rehabilitated ones, carried risk. Public safety required structure. Emotion could not override precedent. And if this one exception was granted, what came next? Wolves in schools? Bears as pets? The judge called for a recess. In the hallway, reporters circled like vultures, but no one spoke to them. Lily's father held her close. Reyes stood by the door, arms crossed, jaw tight. He had seen disasters, fires, floods, loss, but nothing had twisted his gut quite like watching a courtroom decide whether a child could keep the only thing left that reminded her she was still safe. When the judge returned, the courtroom rose. She adjusted her glasses, stared down at the papers in front of her, then looked over the crowd. Her voice was steady but low. "Courts are bound by law," she said, "but sometimes the law recognizes that not all lives are lived within the boundaries of what's written on paper. Sometimes compassion demands we weigh not just danger but devotion, not just rules but reasons." She paused, then continued, "This animal, by every credible account, did what no person could. It found a child. It brought her to help. It saved her life. The law allows for exceptions in extreme circumstances. I find this to be one." There was a beat of silence. Then she said, "I hereby grant permanent guardianship of the animal known as Milo to the surviving legal parent of Lily Ann Hastings under the conditions of monitored veterinary care." Continued. Public safety evaluations and quarterly check-ins. The courtroom erupted gasps, applause. Even the bailiff looked emotional. Lily, still holding her stuffed Bobcat, looked up at her father and whispered the only thing that mattered. "We can. Go home now." And for the first time since the flames took everything from them, he smiled. The road home was quiet, no news vans, no drones hovering above the roof, no more strangers waiting behind fences with cameras and microphones. After the judge's decision, the frenzy began to fade, and the fire station returned to its slow rhythm. Calls came in for brush fires and false alarms again, not headlines. And Lily finally came home. Not to the house that burned, but to a new one built with donated labor, framed with quiet gratitude, and paid for by people who had never met her, but still called her our girl. Milo stepped through the doorway. Before she did, he moved carefully, his leg still healing, but with a confidence that said he knew this place, even if he'd never seen it. His paws tapped gently across the floor, stopping in the middle of the living room. There, beside the new couch and freshly painted walls, was something familiar. A quilt burned at the edges, saved from the fire, and just large enough for a bobcat to curl up beside the feet of the only human he had ever waited for. Lily walked through the front door, wrapped in a coat too big for her, clutching her father's hand. She didn't let go until she saw Milo's ears twitch and his head turn. Then she broke into a run, uneven, joyful, wild. She dropped to her knees and flung her arms around him, and the animal made a low, breathy sound in his throat, the same way he had on the day he led the firefighters. Out of the trees, a sound not of pain, but of something that sounded an awful lot like relief. There were no words that day. Not from the father, not from the girl. The moment didn't need narration. It was quiet, pure, and sacred. Over the next few weeks, life returned to something that resembled normal, or at least a version of it shaped by fire, loss, and survival. Lily's body healed faster than expected, her skin responding well to treatment, her lungs regaining strength. But it wasn't just the medicine. Every doctor, every nurse, and every therapist said the same thing. Her recovery defied what they'd prepared for, and every time they said it, her father simply nodded, glanced toward the corner of the room where a bobcat lay curled in sunlight, and said nothing at all. Reyes came by often, sometimes to check in, sometimes just to sit. The bond between him and Lily had become something quiet and permanent. Not quite family, not quite friend, something deeper. He never said much, but every visit ended the same way. He'd crouch near Milo, scratch gently behind the ears and whisper, "Thank you." It was the only time he ever broke his silence. Spring came early that year. The trees bloomed before the calendar caught up, grass pushed through charred soil, and the air smelled more like possibility than smoke. On Lily's 4th birthday, a small gathering took place at the firehouse. Just neighbors, a few familiar faces, no press, no questions, just people who had held their breath through the worst days and wanted to exhale together for the first time. Someone brought cupcakes, someone else brought a cake shaped like a bobcat, awkward, lopsided, too many teeth, but Lily loved it. Halfway through the celebration, she disappeared from the crowd. They found her a few minutes later, standing in front of the fire truck bay with Milo beside her. Her hand rested on his shoulder. She was whispering again, quiet things no one could hear. Then she turned and walked back to the group like nothing happened. Later that evening, as the sun set in streaks of pink and gold, Lily's father sat on the porch watching her draw on the sidewalk with colored chalk. Milo lay nearby, his eyes half closed, ears still alert. The father leaned back in his chair, hands laced behind his head, and breathed deep. For the first time in months, the weight in his chest had lightened. Not because he had moved on, but because he hadn't had to move alone. Across town, a letter arrived at the mayor's office. It was stamped from a wildlife reserve 2 states away. Inside was a message from a former conservation officer who had followed the story from the first headline. She wrote simply, "I've worked with predators for 30 years. I've seen animals protect, defend, and even mourn, but I've never seen one do what that bobcat did. That wasn't instinct, that was loyalty, that was love." The letter ended with a question. Do we have room in our laws for love? No one answered it, But Lily's story had already become a quiet legacy, not just in the town, not just online, but in how people looked at the world differently. In every small rescue, in every wildfire story, in every child and animal moment that made people stop scrolling and feel something again. Because sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that are true. The ones where a wild creature refuses to leave. The ones where a child survives. The ones where no words are needed, only a trail through the woods, a bloody shoe, and a heart that never gave up.